Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to I Hate Rock Music. Today I just wanted to just talk a little bit about the connection between Marc Bolan and Bob Dylan. And it turns out they never met, but as it turns out, Marc Bolan was a huge Bob Dylan fan. And I'm really intrigued by that connection. And I just started doing a little research and thinking about it a little bit more. And it turns out to be a fairly interesting connection. And as one would have it, Marc Bolan was a huge Bob Dylan fan. And in fact, I'll post this below. Using an alias Toby Tyler in 1964 to 1965, he did a cover of Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind," complete with a harmonica solo. Of course, he doesn't sound anything like Bob Dylan, but it shows that early on um, he had a love of Bob Dylan. And as it turns out, he talks about the whole idea that he just thought Bob Dylan was a great singer-songwriter and completely admired him, and that he often thought of himself, particularly in the early days when he was doing acoustic music with Tyrannosaurus Rex. He felt he was in that area of folk poets like Donovan and Bob Dylan. And so I can kind of see that connection. Of course, Bob Dylan was originally was just a folkie with an acoustic guitar and a harmonica, and Tyrannosaurus Rex was essentially Marc Bolan on acoustic guitar, and then he augmented it with a percussionist, originally Peter Toot, and then later on getting Mickey Finn. But this relationship apparently uh, kind of lasted a while, his fascination with Bob Dylan. There's a great audio that I'll post below of Tony Visconti, who produced Marc Bolan's work in 1973, and they go through a whole 10 minutes of impersonating Bob Dylan. So this fascination that Marc Bolan had with Bob Dylan is amply displayed. And then there's a great quote with Marc Bolan talking about hearing Dylan's new album at the time. It was the Self-Portrait album. And he said that, quote, "I've just listened to Dylan's new album, and in particular Belle Isle, and I feel deeply moved that such a man is making music in my time. Belle Isle brought to my memory all the moments I've ever felt for another human being," unquote. And so that's really great. It's really awesome. That was, of course, that was 1970, and so that's early in Marc Bolan's career. And he obviously was paying attention to what Bob Dylan was doing. I seriously doubt Bob Dylan was paying attention to what Marc Bolan was doing. But even Tony Visconti said that Marc Bolan fancied himself as a Bob Dylan or a Donovan, a folk poet. And I can also see that kind of connection as well because um, certainly a lot of Marc Bolan's lyrics, particularly in the early Tyrannosaurus Rex material was poetry, and a lot of it had to do with word imagery and wordplay, and wasn't a specific narrative. And there's a lot of Bob Dylan material that, of course, he's a great poet, but there's a lot of poetry and a lot of wordplay in Bob Dylan's early work. So even though Marc Bolan didn't really try to duplicate what Bob Dylan was doing, he definitely fancied himself as a folk poet. And there's an interview where Marc Bolan talks about Dylan as being the ultimate songwriter. And then, of course, we have a couple of tributes from Marc Bolan in the song Telegram Sam. There's a line that Bobby's all right, he's a natural born poet, he's just out of sight, unquote. That isn't exactly the kind of way Bob Dylan would write, but it's great that once again we have a great example of the admiration and love that Marc Bolan had for Bob Dylan. And one of the more interesting things for me is an interview where Marc Bolan talks about the fact that Bob Dylan was successful at what he did, and that there was a lot of resistance to him changing his style. And I've come to realize that Marc Bolan kind of went through the same thing. So Bob Dylan, of course, was a renowned folk artist and had a following of beatniks and hippies. And then when he went electric, they completely were shocked by it, and they weren't really along for the ride, at least at first. Not to mention that, of course, Bob Dylan's hair got really wild by the time he went electric. And I see that same transition with Marc Bolan. He got to a point where he realized his audience were beatniks and hippies, and that he was highly regarded in the folk arena. But he looked around him just like Bob Dylan did, and he looked around him in the period of 71, 72, 1970, 71, 72, and he saw everything else that was going on, and he kind of knew that if he didn't make an adjustment, he would be left behind. And I think Bob Dylan kind of came to that same realization. Of course, part of it was just an evolution of what they wanted to do with their music, but Marc Bolan went through the same thing. All of a sudden, he started doing a few electric things on his records, and his old audience really had a difficult time with it. But then he found a whole new audience and completely embraced his electric self and his rock and roll self and started cranking out hits. And of course, what Bob Dylan ended up doing was far more profound and deeper and complex and intelligent than anything Marc Bolan did. But I do find that transition from being a folk hero to an electric rock artist, there's definitely some applicable comparisons, and it seems like there's some motivations that were similar. So I just thought I'd talk about that because I thought it was really interesting finding out that Marc Bolan was a huge Bob Dylan fan. He obviously learned some lessons from Bob Dylan and didn't learn other ones, but I'm always interested in these kind of interesting connections and artists who are inspired by other artists. And I would also point out too the interesting fact that, of course, Bob Dylan has been vital. He's had a couple of down periods in his career, but he's been vital all along, and he's changed his approach to music on many occasions. But he has a gigantic and incredible career that spans well over 50 years. And Marc Bolan, unfortunately, his era of vitality was very short, from about 71 to 73. And his music after that certainly was an evolution, but wasn't a successful evolution. And now of course he's dead, so that comparison doesn't hold. But interesting to see these connections between Bob Dylan and Marc Bolan. Who knew? I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.